We begin this hour zeroing in on two mass shootings that have rocked U.S. communities. The massacre at a Colorado movie theater, and just days later, a gunman opens fire at a Sikh temple in Wisconsin. Both cases tragic, unsuspected, and unthinkable. But for the most part, they're seen as isolated incidents. In both cases, the suspects are young white males, not the typical face of terror, but someone may have seen this coming. A former DHS analyst, Daryl Johnson, wrote a report titled Right-Wing Extremism, Current Economic and Political Climate Fueling Resurgence in Radicalization and Recruitment. Many on the right criticize it as politically motivated fear-mongering.
Right-wing extremists here in the U.S.
This is a funny story.
What is this?
No, this is left wing.
I'd like to tell it.
Oh my God, they're nuts.
Does that mean they're going to be sending spies to these tea parties?
There are no Timothy McVeighs out there right now.
If they're going to issue these reports for this made-up threat.
Conservatives as posing a bigger threat to this country than al-Qaeda terrorists.
Naming veterans groups as possible extremist groups.
Targeting veterans.
Well, his career was essentially over because the administration did not support his findings. So while homegrown terrorism appears to be on the rise, why isn't the media recognizing this dangerous trend? To discuss this is Brian Doherty, senior editor of Reason magazine. He's also the author of the book you see there, Gun Control on Trial. Brian, welcome. So right-wing extremism does in fact appear to be on the rise. Why aren't people acknowledging that?
I'm not sure exactly what you mean by right-wing extremism. And the problem that people had with that DHS report we were talking about is that it combined what we could call hate groups, the kind of groups that Page, the Wisconsin shooter, appeared to be a member of, and people who merely had political opinions that the government didn't like. And quoting from the report itself, things like rejecting federal authority in favor of state or local authority, or rejecting government authority entirely. It's illegitimate, especially for law enforcement, to mix together a set of ideas and label it as terroristic or criminal. And I question whether one incident of one guy with links to these hate groups killing people justifies you saying that there is a dangerous trend that there's some need for the government to combat.
I do want to read you, Brian, a quote from that report. It states, quote, threats from white supremacist and violent anti-government groups during 2009 have been largely rhetorical and have not indicated plans to carry out violent acts. Nevertheless, the consequences of a prolonged economic downturn, including real estate foreclosures, unemployment, and an inability to obtain credit, could create a fertile recruiting environment for right-wing extremists and even result in confrontations between such groups and government authorities similar to those in the past. What do you make of that, Brian?
I think the first part is the most important part, that there is not actually a lot of evidence, and there's certainly no actual cases, except for this one that just happened, of people connected to what they're calling right-wing extremism. Though again, I think that's very dangerous to mix these political ideas with racial hate ideas. But at any rate, there's not one guy has finally freaked out, snapped, killed a bunch of people. I don't actually see how that justifies a policy solution. And this is the same thing that I was talking about on RT after the Aurora shooting. I think people, in their attempt to make sense of the senseless, try to reach for these national solutions to things that are bizarre, individual outlier problems. I would say until we actually have evidence that people from these hate groups are actually committing crimes on a regular basis, that looking for an FBI solution or a counterterrorism solution is really just an attempt to sort of criminalize a bunch of ideas that people don't like. I don't think this one incident makes enough of a trend that we can say anything meaningful about it, and certainly not enough that we should the government should be acting on it in any particular way.
But this incident did occur. It did occur in Wisconsin, and it absolutely was. It appears to be right-wing extremism, and this was a hate crime. We did a story a couple days ago in another state where two mosques were burned down. One of them was identified as arson. The other one is being investigated, but it's presumed that it was also a hate crime. And I mean, shouldn't that danger be acknowledged? And it's pretty clear that since 9/11 that there is this growing sentiment of Islamophobia, and therefore, you know, this could lead to more hate crimes.
Yeah, I will certainly acknowledge that the U.S. government has been encouraging a great deal of Islamophobia since 9/11, and in fact practicing violence and crimes against Islam overseas to a huge degree, which is something I think we shouldn't forget when thinking of these things. But I do want to say it's very dangerous to mix racial hate of the sort that seemed to motivate Page under just the label right-wing thought. Because right-wing thought just means a certain set of political beliefs. It does not mean that you want to commit a crime against anyone. It certainly doesn't mean that you have committed a crime against anyone. And in a world where statutes and control and surveillance of people who the government wants to label terrorists is getting wider and wider and more dangerous, I think it's very risky to start saying, okay, there's certain people who believe certain things. We're going to call them terrorists. We're going to sort of call them hate criminals, even if they actually haven't committed any crime. I think we should look at these things as just crimes. They are crimes. They are murders, you know, these two instances we're talking about. And to spring from that to saying, oh, anyone who thinks the way this guy is, or we're going to label him as something, and so anyone who we think is like him deserves some kind of special scrutiny, I think is extremely dangerous if we believe in civil liberties.
But these aren't just any simple run-of-the-mill crimes. We are talking about hate crimes here. Brian, do you acknowledge that, you know, whether it's extremism on the right or extremism on the left, that whatever kind of extremism it is that breeds hostility and violence is not a good thing?
I'm going to say that any extremism that's merely a set of opinions that you don't like, or I don't like, or the government doesn't like, or that they think is weird, we can't start pretending that we can criminalize thought. I mean, what I'm saying is what we need to worry about are crimes. People who
you can't criminalize thought, but you can criminalize when that hateful thought becomes a hateful and dangerous and deadly action.
Sure, but then what extra benefit do you get from the concept of an extremist hate crime, except to sort of point the finger at people who think the same thing as the person who committed the crime? I think a crime is a crime. Murder is murder. I think it's actually politically dangerous to start labeling them with a set of ideas, because then that becomes an excuse to criminalize or sort of surveil the ideas. And I think that's a very bad trend in America. I mean, you prosecute criminals to the greatest extent you can. Of course, in instances like this, you know, the guy ended up, fortunately, being killed on the scene. So there's not really much more we can talk about it as a policy matter, I think, except to point the finger at people with weird or hateful beliefs. And unfortunately, in this country, until you commit a crime, it should be okay to have a weird or hateful belief.
Do you think, though, that there is a danger? I mean, when it comes to the word terrorist, this evokes a pretty specific image in the minds of Americans. Do you think people have a hard time calling white males terrorists?
I think in the case of Page, I've certainly heard plenty of people calling him a terrorist, given his background and given the target he chose. I mean, we can't talk to him about why he did it, but it's reasonable to assume that he did it with the intent of striking terror in Sikhs or people of a different religion than him or people of a different color than him. To me, the danger of throwing around the word terrorism when I think we should just be talking about crime is, as I said, that there's an increasing set of, you know, regulation, surveillance techniques that are aimed at people who the government calls terrorists. You know, they tried to do this with animal rights activists in the past. They try to do it with people who have just, you know, given money or given what the government calls support to any group they call a terrorist. That's very dangerous. I think the law should focus on actual crimes that actual people committed, not what group they belong to or whether they've given aid to a group that the government has labeled terrorist. It's a very powerful and dangerous label, and I think it's safer to just call a criminal a criminal.
All right, Brian, we're going to have to leave it off there. Appreciate you coming on the show. That was Brian Doherty, senior editor of Reason magazine.